I'm now joined by Sarah Sasse, a partner in our public sector commercial team, to talk about the new model services contract 12 months on. Sarah, can you start off by reminding us why the new model services contract was created?
I think there are two main reasons why there was felt to be a need for a new model contract. The first was that previously we had the OGC Model ICT Services contract, which was developed for IT projects, but that was written back in 2004. It had been refreshed, I think latest was in 2009, but it was getting a bit behind in terms of legislative developments, so it didn't include the Bribery Act, for example. So it just needed a general refreshing. And then secondly, when the coalition government came in 2010, they introduced a number of policies which needed to be reflected in a contract to keep it up to date. So for example, the sharing of performance data from suppliers across government, and also things like the new ways of doing business, the use of mutuals and joint ventures as methods of delivering services which have been externalised by government. And the previous contract didn't really cater for those type of models.
So can you tell me when the new model services contract should be used?
Well, the policy procurement note which accompanied the model contract when it was released, and that's what you see on the Crown Commercial Service website when you look at the model contract, said that it's used firstly for central government departments and their executive agencies and non-departmental public bodies. So that's what it's primarily been designed for, although I think it is hoped that the wider public sector will find it useful. And then in terms of the projects for which it can be used, its name suggests it should be used for IT and business process outsourcing contracts, because that's included in the title of the contract. Value-wise, primarily recommended for contracts with a contract life value of £10 million or more. And then quite interestingly, it is designed primarily for use where you've got an element of dialogue in the competitive process. So not really for use where you've got an open or a restricted procedure procurement.
And in your experience, where have you seen the contract used?
The contract name is that it's a model agreement for IT and BPO services. And primarily that's what we've seen it used for, so IT, BPO type activities, but also for a wider range of services. I think probably because it's just seen as a very useful template. It's got all the schedules written, so it's quite useful for those doing any sort of service procurement. Primarily designed for use by those in central government, but actually we've seen it used by local authorities, by those in the NHS, and even by housing associations, again because I think it's just a useful model contract. Interestingly, from what I said earlier around it having been designed for use with procurements where there is an element of dialogue, so not really for use with procurements under the open and restricted procedure, actually increasingly we are seeing it used for those type of procurements, which does give rise to a number of challenges.
Have you found that there are any particular limitations to its use?
So as with any precedent or model agreement, you can't use it for every eventuality. So if you look at IT developments, for example, then the contract is not really intended for use with an agile type project. So agile development is very much where you don't have fixed user requirements. The requirements and then the solution are developed on a collaborative basis, whereas the model contract is much more a traditional style contract. So you've got fixed requirements, it assumes fixed milestones and a fixed timescale. I suppose the other area where it's not really intended for use is where you've got different service towers. Frequently now, IT procurements are being separated into different service towers to build in a bit of flexibility and also to make sure that not necessarily all your eggs are in one basket. I think the contract can be used where you are contracting for a range of service towers, but it does need some modification.
What does this mean for the supply chain? Are there any additional challenges?
I think as a lead supplier, it gives you two main challenges. First of all, when you pull your supply chain and your bid together, you need to work out what risks you can flow down to your subcontractors. The contract is a fairly authority-friendly contract, perhaps not quite as friendly as the previous OGC model contract, but there are quite a lot of significant risks built into the contractual mechanisms, and you've got to make sure that you flow those down appropriately. And then just from a definitional point of view, I think there are some challenges in deciding who within your supply chain are actually key subcontractors. And the implication of that is that if you're a key subcontractor, you have to flow down a number of specific provisions within the contract. So clearly, if you're leading a bid, then you need to have done all that before your bid is submitted.
By comparison with the old OGC contract, what are the main advantages both for the public services contractor and for the supplier?
I think first of all, it's a comprehensive agreement. So a lot of time and effort was spent pulling together not just an up-to-date front end, but actually all the schedules. So unlike the OGC contract, where a lot of the schedules were underdeveloped or you were just left with drafting notes, actually most of the drafting has been done, and indeed in some schedules there are even different options. Pricing schedule, for example, you can choose this or that option, and all the drafting is already done. Secondly, I think it's tried and tested, and of course that will continue over the next few years as it's used more frequently. And what that means for me is that both authorities and suppliers have time to actually focus on those areas which are really worth discussing. So looking at the service specification, for example, the pricing, not necessarily worrying about the detailed drafting of the data protection clause or whatever. So I think ultimately what that means is that as well as being easy to use, it's actually very cost effective.
What do you think the key points are for in-house counsel to take away?
I think if you're in the public sector letting a contract, then probably the big takeaway is think about the risk profile that you want to flow down to the supply chain, particularly if you're using an open or a restricted procedure procurement, which means that you have to put the contract out with the ITT. You're fixing that risk profile and you're expecting bidders to bid back. So really have a think through what's actually enshrined in the contract and is that really fit for purpose for your particular procurement. And I think if you're in the private sector, so bidding for these types of contracts, because the contract is being used as the template in so many procurements, spend some time looking at the contract, developing your own approach, your own mitigation strategies, and also how you're going to price for particular risks, because actually, again, that leaves you the opportunity to focus on the real commercials and shaping your bid so that you win.
Sarah Sasse, thanks for such an interesting review.
It's been a pleasure.